Hello, and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Carolyn Bubert, President. Tonight, we're talking about policing immigration. Tonight's program focuses on how enforcement of immigration has changed under President Trump, and we specifically focus on local impacts. It's part of our efforts to bring discussions on important issues to the community. I hope after tonight you'll tell your friends and relatives that they can watch this session or listen to it on podcast, and links to those will be available on our website next week. Our website is LWVPDX.org. Our moderator tonight is Barbara Dudley, and she'll introduce the panelists. So I turn the program over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Carolyn. Hello, everyone. Tonight, as Carolyn said, we'll be learning about the local impacts of immigration enforcement under the current administration. So many thanks to our speakers who have agreed to engage with us on this topic tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce our excellent panel, Portland Police Bureau Assistant Chief Amanda McMillan, Isa Pena of the Innovation Law Lab, Elliot Young of Lewis and Clark College, and Mercedes Elizalde of Latino Network. And just a reminder, you can post questions as the audience anytime in the Zoom chat, and they will be answered as time allows at the end of the program. So now on to our panelists. And for more detailed bios of any of our speakers, you can visit the League's website. So our first panelist is Assistant Chief Amanda McMillan of the Portland Police Bureau. Amanda joined the Portland Police Bureau in 2001. In 2014, she was promoted to sergeant, then on to lieutenant and captain. And then in 2023, she was promoted to commander of the Professional Standards Division. Last year, she was appointed as assistant chief of the investigations branch. Amanda will address the role and responsibilities of the Police Bureau, given the conflicting policies of local and state, and then the conflicting policies of the Trump administration. So we look forward to learning more. Thank you very much, Amanda, for coming to speak with us.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. Thank you to the League for putting together and organizing this panel tonight. I think this is a really important discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. And we have this opportunity to speak to the public and educate and exchange ideas and update everyone on this. It really is an honor to be here with so many engaged community members. Today, as Barbara alluded to, I want to speak about the Portland Police Bureau and its commitment to upholding our values, which are protecting, serving, and supporting all the residents and community members of the city of Portland, regardless of their actual or perceived national origin or immigration status. The city of Portland is committed to several core values, but two that really are relevant here tonight that I want to highlight are our commitment to anti-racism and equity. The changes that we've seen at the federal level in the past 2 months have not changed that commitment for the city or the police bureau. Portland remains a sanctuary city within this sanctuary state of Oregon. And Mayor Wilson, upon his election, when he took office in January, recommitted to our status as a sanctuary city. The police bureau follows and enforces Oregon law and city ordinances. We don't enforce federal immigration laws. State law, city ordinance, and our policy in interior here to the Police Bureau make it really clear that the Police Bureau will not participate in federal immigration enforcement efforts. This has not changed. This is not new. We do not enforce immigration law. PPV officers do not ask about immigration status. They don't arrest or detain individuals simply for being undocumented. And we don't collaborate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE on immigration enforcement. Unrelated to immigration, we do work with a myriad of federal partners in full disclosure, and we share information with them when it's necessary, particularly as it relates to serious crimes. These would be, bank robbery, drug trafficking, terror, or human trafficking, but never for immigration status alone. We know, particularly in the context of the past couple of months, that many in our immigrant communities are grappling with fear and uncertainty. Not only about immigration enforcement, but also about hate crimes and discrimination generally. That's why we've been super intentional in the Police Bureau about strengthening relationships within the community. We have a myriad of connections, including Latino network and within the Muslim community, Asian and Pacific Islander communities, Slavic communities, to name a few. Our community outreach and our engagement with these members of the community has a long tradition. We've had those relationships for a number of years, and we're committed to keeping those relationships strong, particularly in times like these. We also work with other community-based organizations like IRCO, the Immigration and Refugee Community Organization, which offers culturally specific services that help immigrants and refugees. We really want to ensure that every person in our city, whether they live here or they're visiting, feels safe and protected, particularly when they report crimes and seek help. We don't want them to fear retaliation or deportation. In the Police Bureau, it's not just about policy or law. It's really rooted in trust. When people are afraid to call 911, when a domestic violence victim feels trapped in that situation because they fear deportation, or when a child fears their family being torn apart as a result of a routine traffic stop, not only does that family or community feel less safe, I think it really contributes to all of us feeling less safe in the city. From our perspective, a just society, it really can't function when segments of the community live in fear of those like the Portland Police Bureau who are sworn to protect them. Some efforts that we've made in addition to strengthening our outreach efforts and being really intentional around that, we've also reiterated to our membership our policy and the law, making sure everyone is up, and that's been communicated thoroughly, our expectations, and how we do not engage in immigration enforcement from the Police Bureau's perspective. Additionally, in January, Chief Bob Day released a letter to the community reiterating just that we don't engage in immigration enforcement. We also developed an FAQ, frequently asked question document, which is available on our website. And I have shared the link, and I think that's going to be shared here by some of our moderator facilitators. It's a landing page with a lot of good information, including Chief Day's letter, and some other links to resources that we have. Also, the Chief Day, he's super engaged at the executive level of leadership within the state, continuing to have conversations with the Governor Kotek, and Attorney General Rayfield on this subject, so that we're all have a good understanding and a good shared commitment to our position. I just really want to end here by assuring you, everyone that's here and everywhere that's going to absorb this later, that the Police Bureau remains really steadfast in our commitment to contributing to the city's efforts to create a welcoming environment that encourages not only diversity, but inclusivity for all in our community. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for the invitation and including me in the panel tonight. I really look forward to everybody's questions and hearing from the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief McMillan. That was extremely helpful information. We will get to questions at the end of the four speakers that we have, the four panelists. Feel free to post your questions in the chat, and they will be curated, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Isa Pena. Isa is the Director of Strategy at Innovation Law Lab, a Portland-based organization founded in 2014 to defend immigrants, to stop illegal deportations, and to support constitutional principles of due process. Isa has been a longtime organizer and leader in the immigrant justice movement. She's the daughter of immigrants from Jalisco, Mexico. Isa also serves on the executive teams of Oregon Worker Relief and Oregon for All, two statewide coalitions providing direct assistance and statewide coordination to protect immigrant Oregonians. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Ms. Pena.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And again, thank you to the League for inviting me today to speak to you all. I think for me, and from my perspective, I think what we know about what is happening kind of at the federal level is really that the purpose of a lot of the executive orders and a lot of the things that we have seen come down in terms of immigration has really been to scare our immigrant communities and to scare states and local officials and law enforcement into compliance and into doing the work of federal immigration, and also scare our community into self-deportation. And I think largely what has been done and the efforts that have been made are really to criminalize our immigrant community. And I want to talk a little bit about the different executive orders that we've seen, but also what we are doing here locally to provide support to immigrant Oregonians, both legal support, but also just community support. We know that there have been several executive orders that include some really problematic things like attempting to eliminate birthright citizenship for children born in the US, whose parents are immigrants, people like myself. Um, also, enabling ICE arrests in sensitive locations. We saw the rescinding of the sensitive locations memo, which really made it harder for ICE officials to go into places like schools, houses of worship, hospitals. We saw the administration rescind that memo, and we've also seen just a broad application of expedited removal and really trying to remove anybody who had been in the country for less than 2 years as quickly as possible without any sense of due process. We've also seen things like the suspending of the refugee admissions program that has allowed many folks who are fleeing violence seek safety and protection in our country. We've seen pauses in the processing of asylum applications for folks who are fleeing persecution and so much more. A lot of the executive orders that have been signed have been challenged, and some of them I think are blatantly unconstitutional. But we know that the law is really on our side, and as I mentioned, many of them have. There have been several lawsuits that both or individual organizations, individual lawyers, but also we've seen our Oregon Attorney General and other attorney generals across the state continue to file lawsuits against the administration for some of this hate towards our community. I think our role as Oregon is to ensure the safety and protection of all Oregonians, and that includes immigrant Oregonians. And I feel very proud to be an Oregonian where we have laws that do protect immigrant Oregonians, like the Sanctuary Promise Law. And we also call on our legislature to really invest in key programs that have protected immigrant Oregonians and that have provided vital support like rental assistance, food assistance, things that all Oregonians need, but I think feel especially necessary in these troubling times. I think our role as Oregon is also to help change the narrative around who our immigrant community is. I think there's an effort to really criminalize our immigrant community, and we know that our immigrant Oregonians are our neighbors, they're our friends, they're people we worship with, they are people that kids go to school with. And so I think part of our role here in Oregon is to help change the narrative around who our immigrant community is and how people can support immigrant Oregonians. As far as kind of ICE arrests in our state, we have seen an increase of ICE activity, which I think is really troubling. But we've also seen I think what is maybe more troubling is an increase in people trying to impersonate ICE, and we should all be, vigilant of that. And I think we have seen several scenarios where targeting and racial profiling is already starting to happen to our immigrant community. And I think coalitions like Oregon for All and Oregon Worker Relief, which I am a proud member of, are doing a lot of really critical work to make sure that we have really safety nets in place for immigrant Oregonians who may be, detained by ICE or maybe fear that ICE activity is happening in their area. Right now, if folks feel like ICE is happening in their neighborhood, is ICE is at their door, people can call the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition hotline. Or if somebody has been detained, a family member or a loved one, they can call the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition hotline to report that. If it is, ICE activity that folks are reporting. There are a team of both legal observers and ICE verifiers that are sent out to make sure that it is ICE that is actually present, and then to provide any legal observation or any support to the family if there is somebody who was detained and the family is left to deal with, things like figuring out what to do with rent or children or, whatever it may be. Um, I will also say that we are really fortunate here in Oregon to have a state-funded universal representation program that provides free immigration legal services to anyone who needs immigration legal services. So if somebody is detained and would like to talk to an attorney, or if they're not detained and has fear of being detained and would like to talk to an attorney, we have the Equity Court of Oregon program that, as of now, has served over 11,000 immigrant Oregonians here throughout the state. And it really, that program helps families with all sorts of immigration legal needs, including things like asylum, work permits, DACA renewals, visas for crime survivors, things like family reunification, citizenship application, the whole breadth of immigration legal services. And so if there are folks who really are in need of immigration legal support, we encourage them to reach out to the Equity Corps of Oregon program to enroll in the program and get legal services. But also if their family members have been detained and they would like to talk to somebody about their options or get support, the Equity Corps of Oregon program is there to really ensure that there are no unjust deportations and to make sure that people have due process and have the resources that they need to at least understand what is happening in the immigration system. This program has been around since 2022. And since then, I think we have had several dozen new nonprofits and legal service providers, as well as private attorneys across Oregon, really working together to deliver these critical services. And they feel more important now than ever to really provide that support for immigrant families. And I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa. There were a lot of specific references you gave of places that people could go for help. Can that be found somewhere online?
Yes, most of those resources that I mentioned are centralized in the OregonForAll.us website. People can find the Equity Corps of Oregon number there. They can find the PERC hotline number there. They can also find additional resources like different toolkits that have been developed for schools and organizations who support immigrants and refugees who may have questions about compliance and making sure that they're following Oregon state law.
And as was just put in the chat, that's Oregon FOR all, not the letter, not the number 4, but spelled out. Okay, Thank you very much. And we will have time, as I say, to get to questions for all of our panelists at the end. But now I'm going to move us on. Thank you very much, Isa, for those very helpful remarks. But I'm going to move us on to Dr. Elliot Young from Lewis and Clark College. Elliot is a professor in the history department at Lewis and Clark, the author of several books on U.S. immigration policy, the co-founder of several immigration scholar collaboratives, and has provided expert witness testimony for over 700 asylum cases. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Young's op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post, the Oregonian, and other publications. So with that, I would like to give you the floor, Elliot. It's yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with all of you. I wanted to, just following up on Isa's presentation, would be remiss if I didn't do the PSA for anyone out there listening, that if ICE shows up at your house, demand to see a warrant, and if it is not signed by a judge, it is not a legal warrant. You do not have to open your door. You do not have to let them into your house, and you can contact a lawyer to make sure that it is a legal warrant before you allow your house to be searched. So there's lots of Know Your Rights training, which go into more depth, but I think that's one of the essential ones. So what I'm going to talk about briefly in less than 10 minutes is the history of immigrant detention and policing of immigrants. So there's a much longer history of policing immigrants that begins in the late 19th century when federal immigration law starts, principally with Chinese Exclusion Act. But in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, most immigrants and most citizens were more likely to be incarcerated in mental institutions and not in jails and prisons. It isn't until the 1960s that, as they closed down mental institutions, that most people end up who are incarcerated or in state custody in jails and prisons. But up until this point, enforcement of immigration laws was entirely left up to the federal government. Initially, Chinese inspectors under the Treasury Department, and then in the 20th century, when the Border Patrol gets established in 1924, the Border Patrol did enforcement, U.S. Marshals did enforcement. There were mass roundups of immigrants conducted in the 1930s, principally of Mexicans during the Mexican repatriation, and in 1954 during the so-called derogatorily named Operation Wetback. But these were handled by immigration authorities, not local law enforcement. All of that changed in the 1980s as immigration and criminal justice became more intertwined, and this is has become known as crimmigration. So what happens in the 1980s is Congress passes laws that created a category of offense called aggravated felonies. This was created entirely in the immigration system. It wasn't created in the criminal system. Aggravated felonies lead to mandatory deportation. Aggravated felonies can, in many cases, are neither aggravated nor felonies, so it's a complete misnomer. Over time, the offenses that counted as an aggravated felony increased. So by the 2000s, illegally downloading music, writing a hot check counted as an aggravated felony, and some of the cases that I've worked on, people that I write about, were picked up for precisely these kinds of very low-level offenses and then ordered, detained, and then deported. So the laws started being created in the 1980s, 1990s, and they also created in the 2000s a program called 287G. And what this program did was deputize local law enforcement officials as ICE agents. And for the places that had those agreements, and of course, Oregon was not one of them because we had a sanctuary law, that meant it expanded the reach of federal immigration, and people who could be picked up for a minor traffic violation in a place like Arkansas, all of a sudden the officer would run their information through immigration, and if they had an order of deportation or had no legal status, they could end up in custody and then in deportation proceedings. So what you really have is a change from federal enforcement of immigration law to all of a sudden a much wider net of using local law enforcement to do the work of federal immigration enforcement. So it's very great to hear Assistant Chief McMillan sort of reaffirm the sanctuary city policy of Portland and the state sanctuary policy, which goes back to 1987. I believe we're the first state to have such a law. And that has been really great in separating the functions of local law enforcement from federal immigration. The only issue or wrinkle in this is that in 1999, a database, the FBI created a database that stores fingerprints from local, state, and federal law enforcement. That was then expanded in 2011. And so anyone who is picked up in Portland for any kind of offense, public intoxication, anything, and booked into jail, they are fingerprinted. That information then is put into the database, and ICE has access to that database. So even though we're a sanctuary city, in this way, local law enforcement unwittingly cooperates with ICE through their regular law enforcement activities. And I think one of the things to underline is that the way local law enforcement operates in Portland is important for immigrants as well, even though they've separated the functions of federal immigration enforcement. So we know in 2017 that half of arrests in Portland were of unhoused people. We know that people with mental illness face higher proportions of being targeted. And so if we really are to have sanctuary for immigrants in our community, I think it also means thinking about a broken windows policing policy that targets vulnerable populations for low-level offenses and basically offers them up into the database for ICE. The other thing I just want to end with is that looking at the increasing detention and deportation immigrants over the last 30 years, this has been a bipartisan project. Laws that were created under Reagan and Clinton were then expanded under Bush and Obama, and then used by Biden and Trump to detain and deport record number of immigrants. So it's easy, I think, for some of us in Portland to point the finger at Republicans and at Trump, but in truth, the Democrats, our own local politicians, helped build a system that has criminalized immigrants and delivered them into the hands of ICE's deportation machine. And I'll just end with, I think, one of the ways this is being carried out in that I think most of you are aware of in New York City. Columbia graduate student Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian, was arrested by ICE. He was a legal permanent resident. They revoked that status based entirely on a determination by Secretary of State Marco Rubio that his presence had an adverse effect on U.S. foreign policy. And then he was immediately shipped out of New York and is in rural Louisiana in a private immigrant detention center, basically without access to his lawyer. So these are real things that are happening across the country. New York is also a sanctuary city, but ICE, that does not prevent ICE from operating. So we're very lucky to have separated out local law enforcement from federal immigration, but I think the struggle also needs to be at the federal level. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a lot to take in. Thank you, Dr. Young. We will get back to that with some questions I can feel the questions piling up already. Our next speaker is Mercedes Elizalde. Mercedes was born and raised in California. She's spent time in her career as a direct service provider, a case manager and program coordinator, as well as in local government. So working at the intersection of direct service and public policy. Mercedes is now the Director of Advocacy at the Latino Network and is also board president at El Jardín recovery and serves on the board of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon and also the Housing Development Center. So we look forward to your remarks. Ms. Elizalde, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and such a stellar panel. Great to see some old friends in the virtual crowd out there. I think I want to begin with an important reminder that it's not just a matter of citizen and non-citizen, that there are so many different types of legal status and resident status that have been created over the years, fracturing our immigration system even more and making it a very difficult thing to navigate. It's not as simple as filling out one application. And even what we saw at the very beginning of this administration was people who did fill out the application, who paid the fee, who downloaded the app, who got in line and did exactly what they were told, were still ultimately punished and not treated as fairly as they should have been. And so when we're talking about this issue, we're talking about people who have lots of different types of status that allow them to live here legally that are being attacked. I know a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing is mostly about immigration that's happening without going through those different processes. But what we're seeing on the ground is really folks feeling like they're being treated all the same regardless. Latino Network has about 11,000 folks that we serve throughout the year through the course of our programs. We have school-based programs in about 55 different schools and 9 school districts across the metro area. We also provide reentry and diversion services for youth and adults who are involved in parole and probation. We provide healthcare navigation services, employment support, housing support, really all the things you can imagine. And what's become kind of our biggest body of work is definitely our immigration services. So because, as I mentioned, there is a huge span of the types of status folks might have, there's also a lot of different questions people have, a lot of different legal opportunities they may or may not have to maintain their legal status. And so one of the things our organization has done for the last several years is to hire navigators, folks who themselves have oftentimes been through the immigration system, who can help answer questions for folks, who can make referrals to those lawyers so that folks can get connected to that work, that great work of the Universal Rep and Organ Worker Relief. We're really proud to be part of that network and connecting folks with those services. And we also do Know Your Rights trainings. And these are really based on a lot of things that you kind of heard from other people about knowing when you need to open the door, not open the door, knowing what kind of documentation someone needs to be presenting to you before you need to disclose anything about yourself. And then most importantly, helping people to try to prepare. I'm going to share a link that I think can get out to the rest of the group. Our immigration service resources page, there are 2 really important pieces there. One is definitely the Know Your Rights. We have now, just in the last few months, done training for nearly 1,000 people. And to give you a sense of scale, we used to do maybe 1 Know Your Rights training, 1 to 2 a week. We are now doing sometimes 1 to 2 a day. There's a huge demand for this information. People want to feel empowered and safe, and having information is key to that. So we've now trained almost over 1,000 folks to know what their personal rights are. In addition to that, we have trained about 40 trainers. So now we have folks within our organization who can now run these trainings in their school sites, which they have in their programs with their participants, with their community members. And we are getting more and more requests every day from organizations who want to know, can you come train us as another nonprofit, as a fellow community member, so that we know what to do when we see these things happening, or when we get questions asked, we can share that information. Over the past quarter, in doing a lot of those Know Your Rights trainings, one thing that came up really loud and clear that folks wanted was, what about kids? And how do I talk to this? How do I talk about this with my kids? How do I explain to them what is going on in a way that's not going to scare them, but also I need my kids to be safe? And so we've now developed a specific Know Your Rights training that is geared towards youth, that was drafted with folks who focus on youth development and who really understand the importance of that work. And so now they're able to now go into schools and do these direct trainings with kids in language they understand, using activities that are made for their learning level. And so that when these things are happening in the community, when they're hearing things on the news or seeing things on social media, they don't have to be as afraid either, because they know what's true and what's not true, and they know what their rights are and what their parents' rights are. In addition to that, one of the things you'll find on that resource link is our Protect Your Family packet. This is a document that was created first back in 2017 and has been updated to now. I would say although it's really specific to this moment, it's also a good tool for anybody for like disaster preparedness. A lot of the tools inside that packet are things like how to identify who can take care of your kids if something were to happen to you, making sure that you have that documented about who can take care of your kiddos, who can have access to your home or your other assets. We really want to make sure that folks are making a plan for if they are detained and they are a primary caregiver, who is going to be able to step in and support them. If they are ultimately deported, how can they leave instructions for how their children can be reunited with them? And so these are important tools, things like where are your important documents and how do you organize them and have copies of them in a safe place. And so many of these things can definitely, like I said, be done for any emergency, right? The kind of things you might set up for a fire or an earthquake, but really taking those and centering it around this particular issue so folks feel prepared. Also on that resource page, we are starting to do as many community events as we can. So every other Thursday, we have a Facebook Live event called Hora Comunitarias. And this is an opportunity for our Director of Community Defense. She's interviewing different folks about the importance of their rights, knowing how to contact attorneys if they need it, knowing how to use the packet. And we're continuing to invite new folks on to participate in that dialogue. We had a family group in person meet with a couple of local law enforcement folks. And I really want to appreciate, I think Chief McMillan really modeled what we saw in that event too, was like not equivocating, right? Not being like, well, maybe, and like keeping people nervous, but being very clear about what the role is and what it's not, reassuring families about where they have trust and where they may need to know what all their P's and Q's are. Because as I mentioned, we do a huge range of services. And so we do have family members who are like, I've been visiting somebody in jail, I am their only family contact and I go visit them regularly. Should I stop going to visit them, right? Or I have a traffic ticket. Should I just not go to court because I should be afraid? And it's great when I think law enforcement are very, very clear that they should not be afraid to continue to engage in life. The example given around domestic violence, I think, is one that I think about all of the time. It pains me deeply to think that there may be somebody who is being abused who literally believes that the police would rather protect their abuser than them. And so when we have these clear messages from our law enforcement and from our elected leaders, that's how we push back against that. I would definitely encourage folks here, if you haven't seen those kind of messages from your local community, to reach out and ask them for it, because we need to be putting those positive messages out and reaffirming them over and over again, because bad news, unfortunately, travels faster than good news. So we have to do that extra work to make sure our community knows that we're looking out for them, that we're supporting them, and that the leadership that is guiding their local governments is also supporting them and looking out for them. I also want to just share with the group that as we continue to move through these processes, keeping in mind that a lot of these services that we're engaging folks in around just basics like food and healthcare, these are things that we all need. And these are things that are also all publicly funded. And these are also places where we're seeing sometimes our elected officials get a little nervous and say, maybe we shouldn't fund those things quite so much anymore. And we need the support of all community members to say, no, we're not going to abandon our values out of fear. We're going to continue to take care of each other, because especially in times like this, it's the most important work we could be doing, is just taking care of each other. And so I think that was a lot. I was really excited to be here with you all and share these stories. Please share that resource link around. Tell your friends about the Facebook Live. Encourage folks to use those resources as much as possible. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Mercedes. There's a lot of information that is coming at you as the audience, and a lot of it is really very, very helpful. So I encourage you to check out the links that have been added to the chat so that you can hold on to that information. You're not desperately trying to remember it all. Before we go on to audience questions, I just wanted to let the panelists have a minute. If there are any clarifications or responses to one another or questions of one another that you would like to raise, having heard all the different contestants here. Is there anything unsaid that you would like to say before we go on to a broader set of questions? All right, hearing none. You can come back with anything if you want to. The first thing I would like to, based on some of the questions, expand a little bit on what recourse a person has if ICE or ICE specifically or law enforcement is not following the law. What do you do if you see something inappropriate happening, either as a bystander or as someone in the family, in the household, whatever it might be? What do you do? If someone is coming in and they don't have a warrant, you ask for a warrant and they say, I don't have to show it to you, or they don't have one, then what? Who wants to answer that?
Well,
Go ahead, Elliot, go for it.
yeah, I mean, my understanding is do not open the door. Have the officer put the warrant under the door, or, put it in a window or some other way, get it to you. But once you open the door, I think you open the possibility for a search. So I think the advice that I've heard is do not open the door until you're able to look at the warrant and verify that it's a legal warrant. So, and the way you know that, even though I think it's difficult, is it needs to be signed by a judge. It'll look official and have all kinds of stamps on it. That is not a legal judicial warrant. So you have to look for a judge and a signature.
But that answer assumes you're inside somewhere with a door that shuts. So what if you're on the street, but you're just walking along the street, or you live on the street, or you happen to be in a store, or you happen to be on your way to court, or anything, but then you don't have the option of shutting the door in the officer's face, the ICE officer's face? What do you do?
Well, Isa could respond, but this just happened with Mahmoud Khalil, where
Indeed.
he got his lawyer on the phone, and the lawyer asked to see the warrant, and they hung up on the lawyer. So it's, ICE does violate the law all the time by not following the procedures they should. But that, Isa, maybe you have a response to what people do if they're approached on the street.
Yeah, I think first I would just recommend, like, everything that Elliot just shared, I think is right on par. I think I would also just recommend that people maintain calm. I think it is often a very difficult situation, often a hostile situation, and often they are likely lying to you about this is a judicial warrant. It may be that they are telling you something that is incorrect. And so I think, maintain and staying calm, I think is really important. Also, remember that you have the right to remain silent. And so, people can invoke that right, and just say, I have the right to remain silent. They also have the right to speak to an attorney. And so those are some things that people can invoke. And depending on their situation, I think they'll individually have to assess, safety risks, whatever it may be. But I think for the most part, it's, if there is a door, do not open the door, ask for a warrant, call the PERC hotline, call the ECHO hotline. There are resources that people can call, but there are also, like, constitutional rights that folks have that they should invoke to and say that, they have the right to remain silent, they have the right to speak to an attorney, and the situation is often very, nerve-wracking, likely probably some of the scariest times for people. And so just remaining calm, I think, is also really, really critical.
And if you are a non-immigrant, just observer or bystander or neighbor, and see something like this happening, and you get involved and say to the ICE officer, show me the warrant, and the ICE officer gets a little aggressive with you, can a citizen be arrested by an ICE officer? Maybe this is a question for Amanda, I don't know. But for any of you, can an ICE step in and do anything to the citizen who's raising the issues?
Yes, is the short answer to all of that. But I would, as Isa and Elliot are articulating so well, knowing your rights in that moment and what you can do, and what things that I would advocate for are, although it seems counterintuitive in the context of Portland, it makes sense. Calling 911, recording the interaction to document the interaction. Those are all things that you can do. Becoming, losing that sense of calm that Isa's speaking about can, jeopardize that witnesses viability as a witness, and we want a witness, we want an advocate in that moment. And so I would advocate for certainly you could attempt to ask questions. I think it's a quick leap to interference, which would put you in jeopardy of being arrested. And so recording, particularly if you think in with Issa's presentation related to people impersonating ICE, I think that's a whole that opens up a horrible Pandora's box of awfulness that you would want actual law enforcement there to address that issue. You have someone impersonating a law enforcement officer. And so those would be my two, maintaining, maybe three, maintaining that sense of calm, record the interaction, call 911, be prepared to document, be a good advocate, be a good witness, and try not to put yourself in a situation that you stop becoming a good witness or a good advocate because you have now been taken into custody. So, and I would welcome everyone to weigh in on that as well.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? I think that was a very helpful answer.
Yeah, no, I would just say from a legal standpoint, having those recordings of the interaction, or if there is something that is done that can help the individual later to fight the deportation, whether the arrest was done in a negative way, or if they're having that recording and having that neutral person who while they may feel like the interaction they want to intervene, sometimes not intervening and recording the interaction can actually help you be a better witness to that. But I also think that, if it's your family member, like I personally understand if you want to intervene. And so I think you as an individual have to make that assessment. But certainly encourage everybody to stay calm, invoke your rights, and record the interaction. We have that legal right to record any kind of interaction with officials. So definitely would encourage folks to do that.
That's very important.
Okay,
wait, hang on 1 second.
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate what Issa just said. You have a legal right to record. And that's important to register. And okay, we'll go Mercedes and then Elliot.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I put in a link to what's called the red cards. These are things that we pass out when we do know your rights trainings. And they say very simply on it, like, I have the right to remain silent. And we really recommend folks just show the card and then actually just remain silent, right? And use that as your communication tool as a way of trying to make sure that you're not accidentally complying. There's also I added another link for the Department of Justice for the state level around the sanctuary promise. And like, these are also places, if you think you see local police helping ICE detain someone, right, and not doing what I think Chief McMillan mentioned, which is like coming to like diffuse the situation. But if you see the opposite, you can also report that. And so I think these are also ways of making sure that we're drawing in the other enforcement mechanisms that help us make sure that we're doing everything that we can to follow state law, for people to invoke their rights, to not be questioned or incriminate themselves. I think these are helpful tools, and the more we can share them, the better.
Thank you. Elliot.
What Mercedes said.
Anything to add? Wait, you're on mute.
To add, no, I was just going to mention the red card, so she covered it. Thanks.
Good. So, but you did raise earlier the question, the Mahmoud Khalil situation, the university student from Colombia. And that raises the question of what are universities doing to reassure or protect their students? What more could they be doing? What legally can they be doing? Since it would seem that the Trump administration has, or in other moments has not, eliminated the sort of safe status of schools or churches and so on. So could you elaborate, any of you, but I'll start with you, Elliot, on that question.
Yeah, so a number of us across the country created something called Campus Sanctuary Network, hundreds of faculty at different universities, to share information about how to protect students on our campus. In general, what universities can and have been doing is in some cases, making public statements saying that they will, to the full extent of the law, not cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, which means that if someone comes to campus, they are directed to go to the campus safety, and the ICE would need to produce a legal warrant that would be reviewed by the legal counsel at the college, and it would obviously, if there is a legal warrant, the university cannot prevent ICE or anyone else from coming on campus. But what they can do is prevent these kind of illegal searches from happening, and trolling for people. So we haven't seen, except for the Mahmoud Khalil, which happened kind of on the street in front of a Columbia University housing thing, but we haven't seen the kind of arrests happening at universities and schools. I think there was some fear of that, and maybe in some places they showed up and were rejected. So we haven't seen that yet, but who knows what could happen in the future. The other thing that universities and colleges are encouraged to do is to go through their databases and get rid of any identifying marks that would indicate if there are undocumented students, because if the college does receive a subpoena, they have to turn over that information. But if they don't have the information, they can't turn it over. So that's one other position. I'll say that at Lewis and Clark, the position of the administration has been to not publicize their protection of students, for not wanting to put what they call a target on the backs of these students. So different schools are adopting different strategies for dealing with this. Some are more public, some are just privately sort of sharing information with those students about their legal rights. But that's a debate that's happening right now.
Yeah, I just saw a question in the chat which had come up earlier, which is sort of what can we do to help from a civilian out there? And there's also been a question raised about, is there enough legal support? And if not, what can we do? And I think that's a trickier question, given that one has to go 3 years through law school to become a lawyer. But there are lesser ways of, without having to go get a law degree, there are other ways to be useful. So could one of you comment on that? I think that's probably Isa or Mercedes would be, or Elliot, I don't know, all of you. Anyone who has anything to say about that?
Sure, I'm happy to start, and then my colleagues, please feel free to jump in. I think in terms of, is there enough lawyers to serve all of our immigrant community in Oregon, the reality is no, right? There are not enough attorneys to provide direct legal services to everybody. And yet, I think we are fortunate as a state to have a program that does provide free immigration legal services. And we need to make sure that those programs continue to exist moving forward. And so some of the things that folks can do is continue to advocate for those programs to be funded, as well as continue to advocate for maintaining and protecting our state sanctuary law, as well as passing funding for things like rental assistance for our immigrant community, food for all Oregonians, right? Like there are a lot of things that you don't have to be a legal service provider to be able to help our immigrant community. That being said, part of the Equity Core of Oregon program and what we are aiming to do is increase the amount of legal service providers in our state. And so that program has 2 fellowship opportunities. One is for recently graduated attorneys to be placed at community-based organizations. And that is really so that immigrant Oregonians can feel safe in going to organizations like Latino Network or other organizations that they already go to for services, and there be a recently graduated attorney that is, barred in Oregon, and provided mentorship from other attorneys to provide, these free immigration legal services. And then the ECHO program also has a accredited rep program. So individuals who don't want to go through becoming a lawyer but want to provide immigration legal services can get an accreditation through the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. And so they have to take a couple of online courses. And then essentially you apply to the Bureau of Immigration Appeals if you're partnered with a community-based organization or entity that is recognized by the Bureau of Immigration Appeals, and then the Board of Immigration Appeals. And then you can be an accredited rep and help people fill out the forms, help do a lot of that work. And it, does not require the same amount of rigor as going to law school, but can provide a lot of those critical legal services. So those two programs are fellowships that people can access through the Equity Corps of Oregon program if they partner with a community-based organization or a legal service provider. But as I mentioned, I think you don't have to be a legal service provider in order to help. You can advocate for the existence of these programs by, calling your elected officials, by submitting testimony in support of these budgetary asks, by, if there is conversations at the legislature about amending our state sanctuary law or getting rid of it altogether, making sure that your voice is heard, that you want to make sure that Oregon is a sanctuary state and that we continue to protect those laws. I think all of those are actions that people can do. And then on the kind of legal observer or ICE verifier, Oregon for All is in coordination with a lot of community-based organizations, putting together some legal observer trainings and ICE verifier trainings for folks who maybe want to get trained on how to, scope out a location, or how to be a legal observer, how to remain calm, how to record these interactions, what to do with the video, that sort of thing. There will be additional trainings happening in the next couple of months that if folks are interested, they can reach out to the Oregon for All team and they can send out when those trainings will be, so that they can get trained up on some of those things. So there's a lot of ways that I think people can support our immigrant community in these times.
Does anybody else want to add anything?
I'll just, I think, double down on the if you are an active engaged voter, which I just have suspicion that this group is, I think it would be really great to contact your state legislator and tell them to double down on universal rep and organ worker relief and make sure that those bills get across the finish line. We know that there's a lot of competition for funds at the state level, and so having the voice of folks in the community sharing that message is really important. Also say if you are in Multnomah County, Multnomah County is also having a very tough budget year, and the Department of Human Services just recommended that the immigration navigation services be cut. And so you could also reach out to your local commissioner and ask them to continue to support local investments that make sure that our immigrant community is able to access all of these resources. Because as we've been talking about, it's not a straight line from I need resources to I get them. We really do need these larger infrastructures where we're navigating folks, connecting folks with lawyers, these hotlines, all these pieces really work together to try to make kind of the spaghetti of the immigration world a little bit more easier to navigate. And so I think using your voice where you can to say that you expect your elected officials to do these things, you expect them to support their community, is really needed now more than ever.
I'll just add one more thing
Yeah.
in addition to what was said, which is interpretation. So if you're a speaker of Spanish or an indigenous language from Latin America or many other languages, it's really important and helpful for attorneys who might not have those language skills to be able to do intake interviews, et cetera. So there are lots of ways I think that people could put their language skills to use to help as well.
That brings me back to a question that was raised early on in the chat, which was about non-Spanish speaking immigrants, and particularly that there are a number of quite a few Ukrainian refugees here with temporary protected status, and other nationalities as well with temporary protected status. And the Trump administration's gone back and forth. In fact, I was trying to remember whether it's on or off, or where he ended this last 10 minutes on that question. And so I don't know the answer to that, but are there organizations and are there people also working with other immigrant communities? And what do we do about the refugees who might be losing their status? Anybody have any answers to that one? Mercedes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that there are definitely the Know Your Rights trainings, and a lot of these resource packets and things like that are translated into multiple languages. Although our organization primarily provides services in Spanish, we've actually partnered with ERCO and with the Afghan Support Network, and we've done some of the Know Your Rights trainings in a multitude of languages with the support of other translators. And so I think at least within the community where we're trying to navigate these resources, we do a lot of coordination across all different kinds of national origin and languages. So I would say if you're looking for a particular resource, I think it can help to start at ECHO, and I think you can also utilize the information that is on just Facebook and things like that. Lots of these nonprofits who do this work really use social media to help, connect with the community.
So on TPS, even though Trump rescinded the TPS for Venezuelans and Haitians, there's a lawsuit, and so it was stayed. I contributed to that lawsuit. So at the current moment, I think they're all in effect. And one thing people should know, it is illegal for ICE to detain anyone with TPS status. So if they try to do that, that is not a legal act.
And Elliot, didn't he threaten or take away the temporary protected status from Ukrainian refugees as well for a minute there somewhere?
I'm not aware of that, but it is also hard to keep up with his his vicissitudes.
I have a question for Amanda, our Assistant Chief McMillan, as it were, about the police bureau. Are you all doing outreach to immigrant communities to talk about your position as you outlined it way at the beginning of this conversation?
We do. And really, we work through CBOs. We work through community-based organizations to accomplish that because we're acutely aware of the fear in the community, and we don't want to add to that, that fear and sense of, the lack of security. And so we're working through Latino Network, Mercedes represents, we're working through other, all of our advisory councils to connect with community, and meeting community where they're at, with the understanding that, we want to reassure and educate, not create more problems and more heartache. So yes, we are doing that.
Okay.
So just to follow up on the Ukrainian issue,
yes.
The DHS did extend TPS for Ukrainians until October 19th, 2026. But I think what you're referring to is Trump has talked about revoking it. But so far, that's where it is.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the instantaneous research on the question. There was another question in the chat about do ICE officers have to identify themselves with some kind of badge or uniform or something? I mean, beyond just asking, do they have the warrant, but even when they're confronting somebody on the street, do they have identification on them, and do they have to have that? Is that a way in which you could figure out that someone was an imposter? Anyone know?
So I'll say, I don't necessarily know like the legal requirement for them disclosing or needing to wear stuff, but I do know that one thing that we remind people of in our Know Your Rights trainings is oftentimes ICE will identify themselves as just police. And so that can be really confusing for folks, but they can sometimes lean into like just being law enforcement, which, really isn't fair to our local law enforcement and the differentiation there, but we know that that's a tactic that they'll often use to kind of get people's guard down, is just to say that they're police. But I don't know as far as like if they're legally obligated to have any sort of identification on them? I know a lot of times folks are just in plain clothes.
Amanda, do you know if there's anything? I mean, we see many photos of them with all the ice all over their uniforms, but I know that they can go in plain clothes. So are there any rules that you know of?
I am not familiar enough with their internal policies or rules
Right.
around how they identify themselves or are required to identify themselves, but certainly a plainclothes response or some sort of modified uniform would be pretty typical. Just in my experience over the years in law enforcement and seeing or working around other federal partners. So that's not atypical, which makes it all the more difficult, particularly when we're talking about folks that are impersonating law enforcement of any variety. So certainly our local rules for law enforcement are different, and our rules internal to the police bureau are very different around requiring the identification and when we don't have to do that. There are some circumstances where we don't have to do that. But generally we are required to identify ourselves and provide certain information.
Go ahead.
ICE is required to identify themselves, and they are supposed to provide verification of their identity, I guess, through a badge if asked.
That's very interesting. So that would be the way to expose an imposter, right? Immediately, right?
Well, the only problem is I've seen the imposter sometimes just get the windbreaker that says ICE police on it. And, it's easy to get a badge that looks official. So it can be very hard to actually know whether someone's legitimate.
And also I would chime in here that legitimate law enforcement, the request may be there, but at that moment in time, I've certainly had, in my career, when taking someone into custody, had people demand certain information or things that I'm not going to provide in that moment when we're trying to affect that custody. And so when and how they provide that information is another level of nuance that that doesn't have to be the first words out of their mouth. And so if they provide that at some time, that may meet the letter of the law, if not the spirit. So just to be aware, simply demanding it may not produce that, even if they are legitimate.
And here's another question about the ICE activity. Can a citizen be detained by ICE? If there's an immigrant and a citizen and there's that encounter, can ICE take the step of detaining the citizen, particularly if they know that it's a citizen and not an immigrant? I'm asking that somewhat on behalf of the people who've been asking all these questions about how can I help and what do I do if I see something happening. So if you step in to, say, where's your warrant, or don't do this, you can't do this, or whatever a person might be saying, can the ICE officer then intervene and arrest that person?
Yes. Short answer. Yes. Just as I have the ability to, I have my policing powers anywhere in the state of Oregon. That's what I'm certified to do. Federal agents are certified to enforce federal law. And so interfering with their arrest or their investigation, certainly there are a myriad of laws and charges that could be brought against someone who has citizenship in the country. And so, yes.
So back, I think, to the very essential advice that people have been asking for in the chat. What do I do if I see something happening? Let's go back and give the simple answer to that. Who wants to start? Isa.
Sure. I mean, I think I would just reiterate that staying calm. You have the legal right to record the interaction. So if you can record the interaction, record the interaction. You have rights as an individual too. So, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. Those are the things that I think are most helpful. But also, I think what Ms. has shared about the red cards, I think carrying one, even if you are a citizen, I think is also helpful, because you have those same exact rights. And, there's a lot of fear, I think, from even our community of, well, if I show this card, does that just mean that I am undocumented, and then they take me in. And I think knowing that there are other people who are exercising their rights in the same way, I think is actually another helpful tool and helpful way to support our community. But yeah, I think remaining calm, recording the interaction, and remembering the rights that you have is probably as concise as it gets.
I am going to ask just one last question, and I think in some ways you've answered it, but I think it helps to hear it again. What due process is there available to an undocumented immigrant who has been detained and who is facing deportation? You've mentioned the right to have an attorney, but what can that attorney do in terms of protection of that individual?
So that's a really complicated question, and I'm gonna pull the can't give legal advice. And every individual should, talk to an attorney about what their options are. I think there are things like expedited removal, which essentially, removes some of due process for folks who have been in the country for less than 2 years, or who cannot show that they've been physically present in the US for less than 2 years. And so I think it's a slippery slope, and every individual, there are different things that they may be able to access. I think if they are, have a fear of returning to their home country, those are things that they can, claim to file for asylum or apply for asylum, and be able to kind of fight the right to remain in the country. And so I think it's hard to give a general answer of what rights people have besides, the general kind of constitutional rights, and then every individual should assess their own immigration case.
So I would just add to that there are two legal systems. There's the immigration courts, which are under the Department of Justice, and then there's the criminal courts system, which is independent and separate. And so one way that people could challenge their detention is through habeas corpus. And so that's exactly what is going on with the Mahmoud Khalil case. They're challenging the detention, his being taken into custody, and that goes before a federal court. So it's different than the immigration court. So for a lawyer can challenge the custody. Is there a legal basis for the custody? And that does slow down the system. And the idea is to hopefully you get them released from custody, in which case it's easier to legally represent that person, and also to then have access to, through the immigration courts, to asylum or other forms of relief.
Thank you. And just one last question. How much ICE activity have we seen in Portland, in Multnomah County, and how much of this is anticipatory?
I mean, I think it's hard to quantify exactly how much. I know we have seen an increase in ICE activity, and what I mean by ICE activity is just ICE presence, ICE at people's homes, and we have also seen just an increase in ICE arrests from the, what was typically ICE activity before. ICE has always been able to arrest and detain folks here in Oregon. That our state sanctuary law does not prohibit that. If they have, they can do immigration enforcement in our state. But we have seen just an increase in presence, and an increase in arrests. And I think, because we have programs like the Equity Corps of Oregon, we've been able to provide people with legal consultations or attorney support if they are detained, as well as, offering whatever options they may have to the individuals. But it's kind of hard to quantify. We just know that there have been increased ICE activity in the Portland metro area, but also in other parts of the state as well.
I would just add that nationally, what we've seen is reflects what Issa is saying. There is an increase in ICE activity. There is a slight uptick in arrests. but it is nowhere near the kind of mass deportations that Trump promised. And part of that is because they don't have the infrastructure to do it. Part of that is because they need local law enforcement, and local law enforcement in many places has won't cooperate with them. And also because they say they're targeting people who are criminals, and there are just not that many of them, of immigrant criminals around. So they can't. So they what they end up doing is actually the vast majority of people they're arresting do not have criminal convictions. This has always been true. It was true under Obama. It's true now under Trump. So I think what we see, the sending immigrants to Guantanamo, this Mahmoud Khalil thing, it's all a theater to
Right.
terrorize immigrants and terrorize the rest of us. And so there is a real like threat there, but also I think it's counting on creating the fear so that people will leave the country or just be afraid and stay in the shadows.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That's a
and
helpful-
I'll just add to that, as part of our work at Latino Network, the Portland Immigrant Rights Coalition hotline, the PERC hotline that was mentioned, we helped to field some of those calls, and we did see a pretty big increase in people reporting what they thought was ICE activity for, most of January, early February, and we have started to see that level off itself as well. And those weren't all verified sightings. Sometimes it turned out like somebody was wearing a jacket that said ICE, and they were like buying a sandwich at Winco, and like just those kind of things were happening, and people weren't sure. And we've seen that start to level off a bit as well. And then we've definitely seen folks sharing to the level of deportations that were promised are not showing to be real, and even some acknowledgement from the administration itself that it has to do with the fact that people know their rights, and people are not allowing themselves to be collateral damage by answering questions that they didn't need to answer, and they're not opening their door when they know that this isn't about them. There was definitely a rash of what we saw was ICE going to like the last known address of somebody who may or may not have had an actual criminal warrant, and then attempting to intimidate and collect information from all the people who now were living there. And so like those kind of things we did see, but I don't think we're not seeing the same level of actual action to the fear. But this again is why it's so important that we share those positive messages and that we're reinforcing our community values, because we need those messages to be just as strong.
Thank you. This has been an extraordinarily helpful panel. I really want to thank you all for helping us get to where we have gotten, understanding what is going on and what role we can play to be helpful. So thank you so much, all of you. Mercedes Elizalde, Latino Network, Elliot Young from Lewis and Clark, Isa Pena of the Innovation Law Lab, and Amanda McMillan, the Assistant Chief at the Portland Police Bureau. We really appreciate you. And now I'm going to turn the program back over to the League President, Carolyn Buford.
Thank you. Thank you, all the participants and Barbara. We had 101 people listening tonight, and hopefully a lot more will see it on YouTube or listen on the podcast. And there's been just chock full of information here. And so what I think we're going to do is compile a list of the links that were in the chat and send it to those who registered tonight. And also we can link that to the YouTube notes. So as much as we can share this information, the better, right? So we want to give special thanks to our League members and the Justice Interest Group for their help in bringing this webinar to you tonight. And please join us next month on April 9th, a Wednesday, for the second panel of our spring education series about immigration. And that panel will explore national immigration policy and humanitarian projects on on migration, and it is hosted by members of our International Relations Interest Group. And you can sign up to hear that panel at our website, LWVPDX.org. Funding for this program was provided by donations from the League of Women Voters Education Fund and from the Carol and Belmont Sailing Foundation. Thanks to Metro East for recording this webinar. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We thank our members for their generous volunteer and financial support for our educational programs. We welcome you to join our league. Membership and donor information can be found on our website, LWVPDX.org. Thank you and good night.